You shouldn't mess around with witchcraft. That's at least what Ben McCulloch taught me. He was in his 80s when he made that point, and although his memory slipped occasionally, there was no way he'd forget what happened on the Silver Tiger. The Silver Tiger was an ocean liner that moved continuously between Southampton in the south of England and New York. Ben didn't know how many times he'd made the crossing. Eventually, being at sea felt more the norm than being on land. He met a lot of people travelling between the UK and America back then. He even met Charlie Chaplin on one occasion, though he was always more of a Harold Lloyd fan. But one guest he never forgot was Ingrid Sebastian. She was making the journey in one of the middle-class cabins, as Ben and the waiting staff often called them. These cabins were comfortable enough, but not as fully equipped for the week-long journey as the uppers. Those were cabins kept strictly for upper-class passengers, along with those from the middle classes lucky enough to amass the funds to break through the economic glass ceiling. Now, Ben, being a working class boy from Paisley, he didn't like the snobbery between the sections on the ship, but he also wanted to avoid poverty himself. Like a lot of people back then, he just grinned through gritted teeth and kept going. It was Ben's job to check that everything was as it should be, for both the middle class cabins and the uppers. He would move from one section to the next, speaking with passengers, ensuring their cabins were fully stocked and hospitable. If there was a problem like a light going out or a lack of towels, it was Ben's job to solve it immediately. In September of 1923, he was serving on the Silver Tiger in this capacity, when one night, at around 1 a.m., one of his service bells rang. Each bell was connected to a specific room, and so he knew immediately that it was cabin 186. Covering the night shift, he moved out of the service cabin down a hallway, and after a few twists and turns, found himself standing at the door to 186. He didn't have to knock. The door was open. Ben would have normally asked politely if he could enter the room, but he heard a voice coming from inside. It was a whisper. "Help me," the voice said. It was that of a young woman's, and Ben, always the great believer in chivalry and still looking for that great first love, no less, ran into room 186 to see how he could help. He described the room as being in disarray. Belongings were strewn around the cabin. The mattresses to the bunk beds were on the floor, and there were papers and other items, some of them broken, littered around the place. It was like the room had been hit by a hurricane. This confused Ben. The waters were calm that night. An old woman stood in the corner of the room. She was wearing a white nightdress, and her white hair was wiry and wild. In front of her was a young woman in her 20s, and she seemed to be consoling her older companion. One of the overhead lights in the cabin was flickering, casting intermittent shadows that unnerved Ben immediately. The young woman turned and hugged Ben as soon as she laid eyes on him. She introduced herself as Ingrid Sebastian. She told Ben that her grandmother, Gladys, was suffering from a profound form of mania that caused her to temporarily lose herself and grow violent. Thankfully, she was too frail to cause much damage to anyone. But Ben looked around the room. Suitcases were thrown open. There was even a book that had been torn in two. Ben thought that was violent enough. Usually when a passenger damaged ship property, in this case a mirror over a wash basin with a large crack in it, Ben would alert his superiors and the passenger would be billed for the repairs. Staring into the green eyes of Ingrid Sebastian, lost in her ruby red lips, her white satin cheeks, Ben found himself telling her not to worry about it. He would sort something, no doubt blame one of the maintenance crew for doing it and not owning up. He asked if Gladys needed a doctor, but Ingrid told Ben there was no need. The episode was passing. She would be asleep soon enough. Ingrid then placed her hand gently, affectionately even, on his cheek, and then asked if it were possible to get Gladys a stiff sherry, as that would often help her fall back asleep. Almost in a daze at Ingrid's beauty, he went back to the corridor to the service cabin and grabbed a bottle of an amontillado that was supposed to be kept for uppers only. Ingrid and her grandmother were in a middle-class cabin, but Ben wanted to make a good impression. He took the bottle of sherry and carried with it 3 glasses. If he was going to open the expensive bottle, he might as well have a taste himself. Perhaps he'd even have enough to build up the courage to ask Ingrid out for a meal once they were in port. When he returned to room 186, sherry bottle and glasses in hand, he saw 2 things in quick succession. The first was that the door to room 186 was now closed. The second was that 6 or 7 intersecting lines had been carved into the wood. Ben was never able to remember the configuration exactly, but only that the sight of those lines made his heart race with fear. There was a sound coming from the other side of the door. It was a muffled noise, a sort of suffocated groan that repeated over and over. Ben finally came to his senses and found the courage to open the door. When he entered the room, he saw only one person. It was Gladys. She was lying on the floor looking up at the ceiling. Her aged mouth was moving in a way he says he's never quite been able to describe. The closest Ben could say was that Gladys's mouth was being pushed downward, as if by an invisible hand. The skin was rippling and moving just as though violent pressure were being applied. Both of the old lady's arms were likewise pushed against the ground. Her fists were clenched, and her nightdress was ruffled in a way that suggested something heavy was lying on top of her. Ben was impotent at the sight, his mind not grasping fully what was happening. He stared down at the old woman, paralysed with confusion. Then Gladys let out a long breath, and the unseen pressure that had been on her body seemed to vanish. She sat up slowly and looked around as if waking from a dream. She had no recollection of what had happened, and when Ben asked her about Ingrid, her granddaughter, Gladys had no knowledge or memory of her. In fact, Gladys explained to Ben that she had never had children, let alone grandchildren. The only thing Ben could do was contact the ship's doctor and have him come to room 186 to make sure Gladys hadn't been harmed by the ordeal. But there were no markings on her, no bruises, no scratches, no sign of anything untoward. Other than the room being in disarray and those strange lines etched onto the door, there was no sign that a woman named Ingrid had ever been there. For the next 5 days, Ben didn't see height nor hair of Gladys. She stayed in her room and only asked that meals be brought directly to her cabin. Ben wasn't even allowed to bring the food in. He had to leave it on the floor outside of room 186. It wasn't until disembarking in New York that Ben finally saw Gladys once more. The sight horrified him. So much so, in fact, that he became consumed by questions he would never, in the next 60 years, find the answer to. That was until a chance encounter in a bookstore just after his 84th birthday. A woman was being served in front of him, and she had a tattoo on the back of her neck. It was unmissable. He knew as soon as he saw it, it was the same pattern of intersecting lines that had been carved into the door of room 186. When Ben asked the woman what the symbol was, she told him that it was Celtic in origin. It symbolised new beginnings and the creation of a new cycle. The original name for the symbol had been lost to history, but modern people referred to it as the lines of rejuvenation. It was a positive symbol, the woman assured Ben when he seemed frightened by it. She told him that the lines of rejuvenation and others had been used by a group of female Celtic healers to prolong life. She didn't take kindly to Ben giving such healers another name. Witch. The lines of rejuvenation. Ben smirked to himself when he told me that, more with disbelief than anything else. You see, the last time Ben saw Gladys on that ship, as she was disembarking to New York back in 1923, she turned and looked at him up on deck. She was noticeably younger than she had been. Her hair now had a youthful tinge of red to it, and her eyes were no longer a faded grey, but instead a deep emerald green. She smiled at Ben before disappearing into the crowds below, and it was the smile that truly gave it all away, because it belonged to Ingrid Sebastian.